Okay, let's unpack this. Imagine the scene, right? You've got bulldozers, workers taking down tents. It's this really sudden, intense action happening. And you've handed us this stack of sources that dive right into it. This recent crackdown on homeless encampments in Washington, D.C. that's been getting a lot of attention. So our mission here for this deep dive is basically to pull out the key takeaways, the really important bits of information and insight, give you a shortcut to understanding what's actually going on with something that's, well, way more complicated than it looks at first glance.
Yeah, and what's really striking, I think, is just how fast the whole conversation around homelessness can shift, especially when you have a big visible action like this one. So we'll be looking at, the immediate effects, what officials said they were trying to achieve, and also some, frankly, pretty provocative claims from these sources about what might be driving the issue beneath the surface.
Right. From like the personal stories of people actually living in the encampments,
Yeah.
all the way to these pretty startling accusations about a so-called homeless industrial complex.
Yeah.
Lots to dig into. So what does it all mean for the people caught in the middle and maybe for how we, think about solving homelessness overall? Okay, let's start with the main event, the catalyst. Your sources detail President Trump kicking off this major crackdown on homeless encampments right there in D.C.
That's right. The reports we looked at point to a direct order. It seems it was driven by the president describing the situation reportedly as a slum developing in the capital. And the action itself, it was mostly about enforcing laws that were already on the books, laws against living on the street. The catch being, these laws hadn't really been enforced, well, for decades, basically.
And here's where it gets really interesting, I thought. This sources say homeless individuals were given this choice. Either go to a shelter or, face potential fines, maybe even jail time. And it sounds like the president was serious about his stated goal to, quote, send the homeless far away from the capital. This wasn't just talk.
No, it translated into pretty significant action. One source uses the term cleanup battalions,
Wow.
describing crews removing, get this, over 70 different encampments from public areas. We're talking places like near the Kennedy Center, the Martin Luther King Library, Washington Circle, prominent spots. So it was a really visible change to the city's landscape.
And the images, they were everywhere, weren't they? Videos of bulldozers, workers dragging tents away. Your sources say this footage gained national attention pretty fast. And it definitely sparked anger, as you'd expect, among some people. But it also became this flashpoint online and in the news.
And it raises the question, what was the official reason given? The justification? Well, the sources mention a claim that violent crime in D.C. was down 26% from the year before.
Okay.
But, and this is important, one report also notes that an officer who was involved in putting those numbers together was apparently put on leave earlier this year, allegations about altering statistics. So that adds a layer of complexity, shall we say.
Right. It complicates that justification a bit. Okay, so that's the big picture, the policy action. But what about the people, the individuals living in these encampments? Your sources give us a window into their lives, too.
Absolutely. And it's crucial to hear those voices. We hear from someone named Megan, for instance, found near the Kennedy Center. And she described her camp very differently, not as, some criminal hideout, but as a stepping stone. That's the phrase she used for her and her boyfriend.
Yeah, that really stood out. She mentioned having an associate's degree, and her boyfriend works like 5 days a week. But they still just can't afford $2,000 for a studio apartment in D.C. That hits hard, doesn't it? It shows the economic pressure.
Exactly. It's not simply a matter of choice for many. And her view on the shelters, that was also really telling. She described them feeling like prison. She said they put you in with like the craziest people, and she was very clear, I am not insane. She didn't want to be grateful, as she put it, for a room with strangers. She saw the encampment as her home, a place where she had some control, some stability.
Her story, and you mentioned another advocate, Thomas, right, who'd been homeless himself for a long time.
Yes, Thomas. He was chronically homeless for, I believe, 29 years.
Wow.
And he voiced real concern about the practicalities of these clearouts, people's belongings just being thrown into a truck. He talked about the potential for violence, the added trauma of displacement.
So hearing these perspectives, it definitely complicates the picture. It pushes back against any easy labels, doesn't it?
Absolutely. It highlights that people end up in encampments for complex reasons. Often economic, yes, but also sometimes a deep distrust or dissatisfaction with the shelter system itself.
Which brings us to maybe the most controversial part of the sources you provided, this idea of a massive homeless industrial complex. Let's get into that.
Right. This is a provocative claim, no doubt. The basic idea as presented in these sources is that maybe, just maybe, underneath all the public debate and screaming and hollering about homelessness, there's actually this whole system, an industry, almost nonprofits, service providers, maybe even some government agencies that, well, kind of benefits from the problem continuing rather than being solved.
Okay, that's a heavy charge. The sources claim this system works better the more homeless there are on the streets. And they even suggest pretty directly that progressives from coast to coast are supposedly getting rich off the plight of needy Americans without actually helping them. How do they argue this actually works?
Well, the argument goes something like this. Billions are spent, supposedly, on solving homelessness without solving homelessness. And the pushback against this crackdown, according to this view, it's not just about compassion. It's also because, well, if the crackdown actually works, if it reduces the number of encampments significantly, all the money is going to be gone.
Okay. Less visible homelessness means less funding for the organizations involved. Is that the idea?
That's the core of the argument presented, yeah. Fewer tents, less funding. It implies a potential conflict of interest, a disincentive to actually find permanent solutions that would reduce the need for those services.
So the implication is that some activists, some organizations, are maybe involved in what the sources flat out call a full-time grift for decades, using homelessness as a, quote, tool to get donations.
That's the accusation laid out in the material, yes. And it raises some uncomfortable questions about incentives. If this viewpoint has any validity, it suggests a serious misalignment. The sources even suggest that maybe some elected officials in D.C. weren't that bothered by the encampments, even near, say, luxury apartments, until this external pressure, this enforcement action came along, that they were fine looking past it.
Okay. Let's shift gears slightly to the legal side of things.
Yeah.
You mentioned earlier that these laws against street living weren't new.
Correct. The sources make that very clear. It was already technically illegal to live on the street in D.C. These laws existed. They just, well, they have not been enforced for decades, according to the material.
So the argument being made in some of these sources is that the president's action wasn't creating a new crime. It was just enforcing existing law.
Precisely. And one source makes a pretty pointed argument about this. It suggests that letting the situation, the lawlessness, as they call it, go on for so long actually makes the eventual enforcement seem like an injustice, that the trauma people experience is partly because they were, in a way, encouraged to break the law by years of inaction.
And who do they blame for that inaction?
The source points fingers directly at the very activists, the very system that encouraged this. It critiques what it calls a progressive solution, letting problems exist, maybe even normalizing them, which, in their view, leads to lawlessness everywhere, like they claim was happening in D.C.
Okay, so that's one perspective. But how did the advocacy groups react in the moment when the crackdown started?
Well, that's the contrast, isn't it? The sources describe an immediate scramble from these groups. You mentioned Andy Wessick from Miriam's Kitchen earlier. He's quoted saying their outreach team, covering 33 square miles, was suddenly working around the clock, trying to find shelter for, they estimated, maybe 800 to 1,000 people on the streets, connecting them with help.
Right. Which, as the sources point out, kind of begs the question.
Right.
Why weren't they scrambling and working round the clock before the president stepped in, if they had the capacity to mobilize like that?
Exactly. It highlights this dynamic where the intense effort seems reactive, triggered by the enforcement, rather than being consistently proactive in finding permanent housing before a crisis hits.
And it wasn't just about finding shelter, right? There was legal pushback, too.
Yes, absolutely. The sources mention legal representatives getting involved, arguing with federal agents right there on the scene, specifically about eviction notices. Apparently, there was confusion over different dates, like a sticker from the deputy mayor's office suggesting people had more time.
So trying to use procedure to delay things.
It suggests a pretty sophisticated effort, yeah. Using bureaucratic details to challenge the enforcement and essentially buy more time for people to stay in the encampments. It points to an established apparatus ready to fight these removals.
Okay, so if the encampments are removed, the big question is, where do people go? Hundreds of people. Do the sources offer any answers or more controversy?
Both, I'd say. You have officials like those in Alexandria nearby saying they have limited resources but are preparing to help the most vulnerable. Standard procedure, perhaps. But then one source throws out this really provocative idea to send people to progressive areas of America. They specifically name Los Angeles, Portland, Oregon,
Whoa.
and then characterize those cities as being run by people who, quote, want more homeless individuals, which again ties directly back to that industrial complex idea.
Right. That's quite the claim. So the argument there is that if D.C. manages to reduce its homeless population, the local funding dries up.
That's the logic presented, that organizations might want to retain as many homeless people as they can in D.C. so that the money goes there. It paints a very cynical picture of motivations.
A picture where the problem itself becomes a resource to be managed, not necessarily solved.
Exactly. It loops right back to that homeless industrial complex theory. The suggestion is that the goal, for some, isn't always permanent housing, but managing the issue in a way that keeps the funding flowing, whether in D.C. or elsewhere.
And there's that stark line from the sources, too, about funding.
Yeah.
That the places that seem to fund homelessness the most are the places that seem to have the most homelessness, just stated as an observation.
It's an unsettling correlation, they point out, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
And it forces you to ask, what is the truly compassionate but also effective thing to do here? Is it maintaining people in encampments, even if conditions are poor? Or is it enforcing laws, pushing towards permanent housing, even if that means disrupting the current situation and the systems built around it? It's a tough question.
Okay, wow. We have definitely gone deep today into the real complexities of homelessness in D.C., the crackdown, and these, frankly, startling claims surrounding it all.
Yeah, we've really seen how one big action enforcing existing laws essentially just blew open this huge debate. You've got the voices of people experiencing homelessness, the scramble from activists, city officials managing the fallout, and then this whole other layer, this theory of a homeless industrial complex potentially profiting from the situation itself. It's a lot of conflicting perspectives.
Right. From the basic challenge of just finding somewhere for hundreds of people to live, to this really uncomfortable idea that maybe, just maybe, some parts of the system benefit from the problem not being solved. It's definitely not simple.
And what's fascinating, I think, is how it pushes the conversation beyond just, look at those tents. It makes us question basic assumptions about what compassion looks like in practice, about whether our current systems are truly effective. It really forces the question, are we tackling the roots of the problem? Or, as these sources provocatively suggest, are we sometimes just managing the symptoms in a way that actually benefits some players in the system?
So as you're thinking about all this, here's something to chew on, maybe. In a situation like this, a public crisis, is the most compassionate path, always just letting things continue as they are? Or is there a point where decisive action, tough enforcement, even if it causes disruption and feels traumatic to some, might actually be necessary? Necessary, perhaps, to shake up systems that could be, even unintentionally, keeping people stuck. Something to definitely mull over as you continue your own deep dive. We hope this gave you plenty to think about today.